There will be an element, maybe 15-20 minutes, so I want people to sort of get into 4 groups and have a discussion. Bearing in mind the audience I'm addressing, I'm not going to make any suggestion how you organise yourselves in this community space, but essentially you will need to go into 4 groups. I need 2 volunteers as well. I've already volunteered John and Mike last night to kind of convene groups. So before I ask Alison to do it as well, she's not listening. Alison has just been volunteered because she's ignoring me. So, if I could have one more person to volunteer to kind of do the feedback from their group. In which case I'll ask Jane to volunteer somebody for me. We'll give it some thought, but I will need 4. So, good morning everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Yeowell. I'm the head of policy and external affairs at NPC. There you go. So NPC is one of the leading think tanks and consultancies for the charity and wider social sector. It's been going since 2002. This is going a bit quicker than I wanted it to do. And what most people know us as is we are the impact people. So essentially, we're very much on the provisional wing of sort of the impact movement, trying to ensure that everybody can maximise their impact and their evaluation tools to sort out exactly. This is going far ahead of itself. It's lovely watching you looking at Supergirl, but it makes no difference if it's not watching at the right time. So essentially, yeah, so our shtick has been, for most of the time we've been around, it's about impact and getting charities to take it much more seriously, to actually maximise our impact for our communities and for our causes. And actually, I've been here since January, and I'm doing some much sort of crunchy thinking about actually what kind of policy areas can we have a view on and take a handle on as well. And specifically, I've been doing a lot of work on place. Now, just to tell you why that is the case, and this is a bit about me and where I've come from. So that is me at the back, dressed as a Supergirl. There's a reason for showing the slide. It's not just to get a cheap laugh out of you. The hungover ones. So essentially my background until this year is not in the charitable sector. I've spent the past 18 years working in politics, working in campaigning, and working in some public service reform type roles, specifically at the LGA, which I think John has mentioned this morning, spending some time at the London Borough of Sutton as well, doing some public service reform there in the last couple of years. Definitely in Sutton, we had a lot of, spent a lot of time dealing with community action in Sutton with Alison Navarro, if any of you know about her. I was actually trying to think differently about how you get CVS bodies in the wider sector in at that point of creation with the local authority and other public service bodies to start deciding what the strategy or the vision or the route might look like, instead of deciding halfway down the road that you forgot to think about it. You now need to add you on at a later date. I am a trustee myself of a very small charity back at home in Pontypool in South Wales, and that's where the photo is from, called Track 2, which is a tiny sort of crisis alleviation sort of anti-poverty charity based in the most deprived housing estates outside of Pontypool. And actually a lot of my work with them has really actually had an impact on my thinking in terms of my job at NPC, because essentially Torvald has a population of 90,000 people. We alone helped, I think, 280, 300 households last year. Some of them now are actually in really serious sort of difficulty and issues of isolation and poverty. And it's got to the point, if we don't exist, there is no other organisation in the borough, quite frankly now, that is there to pick up the pieces and to try to help to rebuild the lives and empower that community to be better. So it's made me think, actually, how can we properly rethink and recharge our relationships in the places where we live and where we do our business and actually make our lives, and how, if possible, in the current climate, we can press the reset button and have a better set of relationships. So that's why we've been doing a lot of work on place at NPC. I think everyone here would agree that essentially civil society and the spaces that we share together basically are the glue that binds our communities together, and that essentially we are all vital to the creation of that good society that we are all here to create. I think the relationship between the social sector and local public services is crucial to this, as we've heard already this morning, but also is under threat now, as it hasn't more than ever has been, quite frankly, in our lifetimes, as the effects of austerity are testing local authorities, quite frankly, to their limit. Northamptonshire, as an obvious example, it's been in the news quite a lot recently, is going to be followed into what is effective bankruptcy next year by a number of county councils. I'll be talking to one of the senior executives at Surrey recently who's interested in actually getting more involved with the social sector. He turned around and said to me, I have to make £220 million worth of cuts by 2021. Now, good luck to him. Quite frankly, that will be nothing short of a fire sale, and there is no opportunity or ability in the next 2 years to try and do something meaningful and useful in that circumstances. I mean, despite what Philip Hammond suggested was an increase in local government spending in October's budget, councils still have to implement, I think it's £1.3 billion worth of cuts in the next 2-3 years, which essentially is the biggest amount of cuts that they've had to make since the in-year cuts ripped their guts out of a lot of that work that was being done in a positive sense in 2011. The settlement was postponed this week. I guess in the whole context of where we are shouldn't tell us very much, but let's be thinking about it. Local government funding finance regimes are due to change in 2021 because of business rates. Local authorities do not know what they are going to be yet, so they can't even plan for what's going to happen in the future. It's a bleak. I'm not going to swear if you don't know me well enough. I mean, this is obviously having a huge effect on the wider social sector. Oh, bloody hell. In research that was published earlier this year, I'll just let it go, 78% of local charities reported an increase in demand for services, and 85% are predicting further increases in the future. Of the respondents, only 14% felt that they had sufficient resources to meet this need, and worryingly, over half of the charities that responded basically fear for their survival or their existence within the next 5 years. So, as John has already mentioned, after a decade of austerity and with Brexit on the horizon, I think it's time that we need to take a radical rethink, basically, about how the public sector, the social sector, and the progressive elements of the business and commercial sectors can work together to both pool and maximise our resources and our expertise, and then maximise our collective impact in those places, basically, that we call home, where we live and where we basically foster the kind of lives we want. So essentially, it's all about how can we put our prejudices aside and come together to put local people and local communities and our local places in the driving seat for meaningful social and economic change in the future, and try and get out of the wreckage of where we currently are. So, as part of this, we've been doing some thinking. So actually one of the things NPC does quite well, because we deal with both organisations, charitable organisations and voluntary organisations and funders, is started to convene some conversations down in London, so I apologise, it's mostly sort of national bodies and umbrella groups we're talking to, about actually what is the voice and what stance does the sector take on this idea of place. So having come from a local government background, this is something I've been talking about for 15 years, about localism and how you do it. What I find coming over is quite interesting. At no level, seemingly, is the voice of the voluntary sector and charities taken seriously in that ongoing policy debate about what potential shifts to greater place-based approaches to how we work might be. So we've ended up having some conversations, and in October, a number of us met. And Kathy was there as well. And essentially, it's been published today. I think it's definitely in the sector press. The Guardian said it was a bit too abstract. And didn't contain the word Brexit, so it was unlikely to be reported. But essentially, we've come out with a declaration, a statement of intent, from some of the think tanks and the larger umbrella organisations to say, do you know what, we're going to step up to the plate and do some of this thinking. Now, we're not always going to agree, and we're not going to have a definitive line of what the social sector view on place is going to be, but it's time we started making some noise, and actually we ought to go back to local government, to central government, and crucially to our funders to say, hang on, we have a sense of agency in this debate and we want to tell you exactly what we think should be happening and what priorities we have. So, these are the organisations that signed up to it. So, NAVCA's involved, we're involved, there's a variety of different types of organisations looking at different specialisms. And I think the ideal would be, hopefully we can get this sent round, Jane, Tom, after the conference. I want to be using this as a calling card for the next couple of months, so we can all go out there and talk to your member bodies, or talk to the charities we work with to see if they're interested in signing up. So we've got 6 or 7 bullet points of the things we think we need to be doing over the course of the next 12 months or so to get us into a much better and stronger place. We need to find a new word for place, by the way. Because actually once you say it once, you end up realising you say it about 14 times in a sentence. So essentially, the main thing about the declaration. So essentially, like I said, we're a group of national charities, think tanks, social infrastructure and umbrella organisations that want to rethink how the social sector works with our partners, with our communities and to further the causes of champion. We want to engage the people in the places where they live and they build communities and actually improve the efficacy of the sector, to improve our accountability and our legitimacy, basically in order to maximise our social impact and our charitable missions. So we've come together to advocate and begin to campaign for a broad shift in thinking towards more meaningful forms of place-based social change and transformation, adding our voices to the growing chorus of local government and progressive business figures calling for the same. I think service development, delivery and collaboration with local people to meet the needs of their place, as opposed to providing services that are merely delivered in that place, we think are key to actually developing some of this. It'll mean taking on new responsibilities, essentially, in the organisation of local places, in the partnerships and the strategies that underpin them. It will also require fresh collective thinking about the long-term future of commissioning and public service markets that already stretched to their limits after a decade of austerity. And as a group, we're committed to learning from those who are doing it well and helping those who aren't doing it yet. We will use our organisations to innovate, to disseminate best practice, share knowledge in the process. So essentially there are 7 pledges. Where the participatory element comes in, is I want someone to talk about 4 of them. 3 of them, the first 3 are to discuss how better to shape and agree a place agenda. So I didn't really think I wanted to send you off into the groups to discuss about how you discuss it, so tick, I've done that one. The second one is to make a case for new models of place-based organisation, and I'll come back to that after I've asked you to speak, because I think that's some of the work I'm doing, and I'm really keen to actually have conversations with people about it next year. And then the third one is about better utilisation of data. So it's quite key. One of those organisations involved is 360 Giving, who's done some fantastic work. GrantNav platform, and there might be some really good news to come about that next year, so keep your eyes peeled. It's basically how we can share that data that we all have across sectors and with each other to start thinking, actually, how can we properly nail those outcomes that we are coming together to kind of try and grapple with and get our heads around. So, today's challenge, if you accept it. These are the 4, or these are a variation of the 4 remaining principles that we're talking about. So, this is the point, I'm going to ask you to go into 4 corners to organise yourself, and I want one group to think about each one of these, and maybe have 10, 15 minutes to come back and then have some feedback. So the first one, if anyone does have this, you should sell it to the highest bidder if you've got the proper answer. How can we work together to better overcome austerity? I think the key here is actually from where we are, how can we actually sort out commissioning to be better? Also, in the knowledge that we have to actually do the commissioning as it is at the moment before we get to the place where we think we could do it better. The second one is actually, what are the local tools that are being developed to help communities and charities, businesses and public services to build up and renew their place networks to make them more vibrant and to make them more resilient for some of these challenges ahead. The third one basically is, if you had a blank piece of paper, how could we agree priorities for reinvestment in social infrastructure and how can we make this happen? I think something we argued for in our submission to civil society strategy, if you all remember that, was essentially that if there was going to be a return to some limited grant funding, we wanted that to be targeted at areas of low social value, and we wanted that money to go into extra investment and support for you lot, for social infrastructure bodies. We had a nice line back saying, well, we might do it, but we're not going to do it in a targeted way, because quite frankly they didn't want to put the word redistribution into the report. And then the fourth bit, which is basically more of a soul-searching question, this concept of what does improvement look like in the social sector. What help and development needs are there out there, and actually how can we overcome them? And actually what can some of the think tanks and the bigger bodies, not just NAVCA, but NCBO and some of the big charities, if we could come together to help upskill and provide you with that support, what would it look like? Because the same senior exec from Surrey who told me he had a lot of money to try and find, basically said he wants to work with a lot of social bodies, but looking at the transformation his organisations have gone through in the past 10 years, he's not quite sure that many of the organisations that you represent are up to the challenge of working with sufficiently transformed units of local government. I think in my head, ideally, I want to be a set of Lego. We can all snap together around our areas where we are. I think that's actually how do we potentially get to that place. So, if you could now stand up and flex and discuss, probably give it to about 11:30. So, over to you.
Just thinking about practicality of tools.
While we're still in that very competitive, controlled environment, it's not really changed.
But it's interesting if you would speak with justice money, so we have simple puzzles or play, which is
So, Alison's team, who's going to give the feedback? You, okay. Robin?
Delighted to be nominated, thank you. So, we have the question back then?
Yeah.
So we had some personalities in our group, and sorry, start this off. So first of all, we questioned the question just to be difficult in terms of why are we necessarily suggesting that reforming and commissioning will help with austerity. So we almost wanted to take that austerity bit, put it to one side and talk more about commissioning. We spoke about, is commissioning necessarily a system that we wanted to reform, or would we like to have something completely different? But we did talk about some great examples. Sorry, where are you? Rotherham, where an infrastructure organisation like ourselves could be tasked with ensuring some of those smaller groups are able to access commissioning. So examples of where it can really work. We also then started talking about social prescribing and some of the pressures to try and look at how social prescribing can achieve short-term outcomes, where actually, if we're talking about preventative work, those outcomes could be further down the line, and maybe we need to be supported to be able to invest in it long-term rather than try and get some quick wins. Any other bits I've missed?
Good summary.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll go to this group at the front next.
Yeah, we were doing number 4, random list really. Personal relationships are vital, but behaviours aren't always helpful. So some sector improvement around that would be good. We thought that involving service users to try and shift commissioning is really critical, but hard to do. We also thought that we need to look at local government that is changing. There are some really good examples, not all the bad ones, and they're doing things differently, and often they do that by working with civil society closely. Example in Cambridge, for example, Barnsley, Preston, etc. Skilling up local people to be involved in those discussions and not just doing it ourselves is really vital. But there was a very strong feeling, and I checked this out before I did the note, that we don't want nationals coming to tell locals how to do the local, and particularly national charities competing locally, and that we are not disconnected from place. So, challenge back to you.
I wouldn't. That was so far away from what I was suggesting. That's fine. Don't worry. I'm not suggesting that. So, complete point taken. In John's group in the back quarter. Does anyone want feedback?
So our group was basically, number 3, agreed priorities for reinvestment in social infrastructure, so I'll take that one first. So reinvestment through co-producing with us, strategic planning and strategic developments. Being part of this inclusive economy approach, so making sure that inclusive economy is not just about procurement of goods and services, but making sure that there's procurement of community infrastructure, social infrastructure, and making sure that basically a lot of discussions I've recently had is about people, certainly in the funding world, commissioning world, duplicating a lot of funding priorities, a lot of money going into the same places, and not necessarily creating the impact that's needed, thinking about how we realign that and work together towards a more place-based solution. So how do we make this happen? It's critical that the community and the voluntary community sector are part of the solution. We need strong, trusting relationships with local authorities, with the local NHS and other funders, and also mutual accountability, making sure that it's not just one way, but actually, somebody mentioned, the mayor's pledges, making sure that we're able to make sure that locally everybody's accountable. So it's not about the voluntary community sector going in talking about where's the money, where's our money, but actually saying how do we mobilise the sector to enable integrated, combined, blended solutions, which is about place-based impact and progress.
Okay, great stuff. Then finally, over there.
So we were doing number 2, locally developed tools to help communities, charities, blah, blah, blah. Where we got to was basically recognise where the real knowledge of a place is, and it might not be in any of those things. It might not be in organisations, it might just be in local people, and go and talk to them is probably a good place to start. And even within those organisations, it might not necessarily be where you think it is. So we were talking about going out and talking to the community police rather than the chief constable of the area and all that sort of stuff. Use creative approaches. Don't have an idea that you can just develop a network. You have lots of networks. It's a fluid conversation. It's constantly evolving, reforming. In fact, it should keep constantly reforming, because otherwise you get that thing of very staid, static networks where it gets dominated by one or two voices over many years. Lots of stuff about tools. Planning for real change was an example from Leicester. Actually, we know perfectly well how to do this stuff. We used to call it community development, and if people would just give us money and let us get on with it, we'd solve all that, because we've been banging on about it for decades, but also tell the story of how it works.
Cool. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone. Running over time. So essentially, those last few, of course, the next 6 months, I think we're going to be doing some work with NPC at least, and then also some of the organisations. And actually, I'd like to come back, if I can, via NAVCA to kind of, if not actually come and talk to you, but maybe sort of have some conversations with you remotely. I think 2 things I'm looking at are issues about new models of place, particularly, which is quite frankly off the back of all that stuff I was saying about the financial position and just generally where we are socially. It can't continue, and it isn't right, it's not fit for purpose. So, on 2 levels, what would it look like if actually you could get the social and the public and indeed the private sectors in places where you live to have a much more rational, consolidated relationship and discussion about actually how they want to organise that local authority area, and to start having a more mature relationship about actually how you devise that strategy, how you come together to agree that vision, and then off the back of that have discussions and conversations about basically, many of you should not be involved or don't really want to be involved in commissioning as it is. You should be actually fundamentally designing and co-designing the policy from the get-go, or ensuring that you are engaging with the local communities to ensure those policies make sense, and how do we work backwards, if you like. And the second part then is, this is about new funding models. I'm having some conversations about how we talk with funders to get them to start thinking differently about how they invest in local areas. And that's what I'm going to try and also have some conversation about, is if we could start looking back at all that total place conversation of 10 years ago, if you could add to that charitable spend and then try and get philanthropic spend into that differently, what would it look like if we could blend the current the funding streams to consolidate funding to properly try to sort of push the sort of transformational change in the areas you're operating in, instead of everybody feeding around trying to grab different bits of money and competing against each other. So that's what I kind of want to do. It might be a bit more than I might be biting off more than I can chew, but if I could have a conversation about that in the next 12 months, it would be really helpful. So there we go. Thank you very much. We've overrun massively, but the tea and coffee is back in the room next door. Thanks.
I'm going to let you go through your copy in a